Snow fell like sifted ash through the smoke hole, slow and steady, and the torches along the walls hissed whenever a stray flake wandered down to touch their pitch. Winterfell's great hall smelled of oak smoke and wet wool and the iron tang of men who had not taken off their mail in days. The benches were crowded with men and women who had given blood and sons to win this place back, and with lean strangers wearing furs and bone charms whose voices never bent to the cadence of kneelers. 100 eyes tracked the doorway as it opened and closed on gusts of white cold, bringing with it the bite of the yard, the muffled clatter of hammers, and the distant bark of a white dog somewhere in the snow. At the far end of the hall, the dais wore Winterfell's history like a mantle. 2 carven dire wolves flanked the high seat, their muzzles grayed by smoke and time. Jon stood before them, not seated, not great enough for the chair that had belonged to Eddard Stark, but tall and straight as the words his father had once left him. The man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. A pelt of shaggy fur lay across his shoulders, dampened down the back with melted frost. Longclaw rested against his thigh, the Valyrian steel catching firelight in fitful blue glints. The knives of the north had gathered to hear talk of food stores and watch rotations, of Valesmen marching home and winter roads to the last hearth. Lady Lyanna Mormont sat with her jaw set like a blade, small and keen as any steel produced from Bear Island's scant forges. Davos leaned in shadow near a post, his face an old map scored with weather and the memory of smuggling salt through storms. Jon Royce had placed his heavy body in armor beside the aisle, as if he meant to hold the line even in a hall. Then there were the free folk as they insisted, clustered at the left under banners they did not recognize and refused to salute. Their chieftains wore their pride on their belts. The antler knives and obsidian points, the iron brought south at a terrible price. A few had braided their beards with coins taken in battle. One had taken an ear from a Bolton and wore it now to remind himself what had been won and what had been paid. She stood among them, hair the red of autumn leaves after frost, face turned up toward the high beams as if judging how hard and how well the south held its roofs. Her hair escaped her braid in shy flames, and her eyes were that particular northern brown that holds warmer colors in it if the fire is strong enough. Ygritte had wrapped herself in skins that made a northern weaver scoff and a free folk woman lift her chin because they were the particular skins she had chosen. She looked at home under stone. She never would, but she could make any place pay attention when she opened her mouth. Jon had not told Davos. He had not told Sansa. He had turned the words over in his head through the night while snow creaked in the eaves and the castle murmured, as living things do, and his breath had smoked in the dark as if the truth were already leaving him. He had watched the snowflakes catch in Ghost's fur in the yard until the big white beast had nudged him as if to say, "Get on with it." Sansa sat near the high seat, her hands folded neatly, her hair dark as their mother's had been, her gown sturdy and northern. She had the look of someone ready to hold her face steady no matter what she heard. When Jon stepped forward, she cut a glance toward him that made him feel 12 again, stealing bread from the kitchen before supper. There was worry in it and something harder underneath, calculation. He realized with a pinch in his chest he recognized as unfairness. She had learned that hard currency from Peter Baelish and from the world. He would not belittle the effort it took to put it down when she could. He would only hope she could again, for him. "My lords," Jon said, and his voice was not loud but it carried. The great hall quieted as if a hand had been laid on it. "My ladies, we have talk of roads and men, of how best to keep the grain from rot and the children from cough. We'll hear those things. But there is something I must say first." Tormund Giantsbane leaned an elbow on the table in a posture that announced boredom and concealed curiosity. "Gods," he muttered to the man at his side, loud enough to be heard 3 benches away. Another speech. Someone smothered a laugh, an honest spark in the cold room. Jon's hand was steady on Longclaw, the pommels carved wolf cool under his fingers. "Some of you know there is a woman among the free folk who once had reason to want me dead. She knew me better than most. She took me prisoner. She let me live. She fought at the wall, and she walked with me beyond it when few would. She has bled for the living. She has bled for us. I won't say her name as if I were making an apology. I won't say it like I was spitting a seed. I will say it like the truth it is. The silence changed in character, sharpening the way a frost-sharpened knife glints when it's turned to the light. Even the torches seemed to wait. I love Ygritte of the Free Folk, Jon said clearly. There. The words dropped into the hall like coals. And I intend to have her at my side and to be at hers, as long as we're spared to stand and breathe. I won't hide it. I won't pretend it matters less than it does. We need to be honest with one another if we mean to hold through winter. So there it is. Judge me for it. You will anyway. It struck the hall like a flurry. Murmurs, incredulity stunned into laughter in one corner, quickly swallowed. The expression on Lord Glover's face was the anger of a man who had given too much to a cause and does not care to see it made complicated by love. A manderly cousin rolled his eyes like a man in the habit of indulging romance when it didn't get in the way of bread. Jon Royce's eyebrows shot up to his hairline, which was not a journey they often made. Lyanna Mormont did not blink. Davos inclined his head in that small way of his that could be acquiescence, could be sympathy. Sansa was still. Only her knuckles whitened a shade where her fingers pressed together. Jon saw that, and the part of him that was silent and watchful, the part that had learned to see men before they moved, made note and then set it aside. He felt also Ygritte's gaze like a thrown rope. He took hold of it with an inward warmth that had nothing to do with the torches. Of course, Tormund barked a laugh, short and reverberant. He does know something, he said, and the free folk with him grinned with the tempered amusement of people waiting to see if a joke ends with a punch. A haggard man in Glover's colors pushed himself up from his bench. With respect, Snow, he said, making of the name a courtesy and a refusal both. The North did not freeze and bleed and bury sons to see the wildling whore put her feet up by our fire. There were other voices, sharper, uglier. Jon Royce said, "Allow the king," and caught himself because Jon was not that. Not here, not yet, and perhaps not ever. Allow Lord Jon to finish. I'm no lord, Jon said. I'll be nothing if we don't hold this winter. Will you be someone if we do? That was Sansa, quiet but carrying. Her voice smooth as snow laid over broken ground. Heads turned like weather vanes toward her. She did not look away from Jon. Will you tell me first if you intend to marry? I'm not asking for permission, she added before anyone could use the word. I'm asking for trust. If you intend to make of our fortunes a bridge between peoples, I can help. If you intend to make of our fortunes a fire to warm yourself, that's something else. The torches hissed. Somewhere outside, Ghost barked twice and then was silent. Jon met Sansa's gaze and understood the question she did not ask aloud. Is this for you or for the North? He had asked the same question of himself until Dawn's thin white blade slipped between night and morning. For the North, Jon said, and for myself. Both. It doesn't have to be a choice. That's what men say just before it becomes one. Davos murmured, not quite under his breath, with that weary honesty Sansa had come to rely on. Let the girl speak, then, Tormund rumbled, turning to look for Ygritte with a grin that was more fatherly than he would ever admit. Let the girl tell us whether she'll have him. Maybe she's not so easily had. Ygritte was standing now. She hadn't moved forward. She had never been one to move anywhere she didn't want to. I'm no man's to take, she said, not loud but in a voice that carried like singing in a cavern. You know that, Jon Snow. It was not accusation. It was reminder. It was a rope pulled tight between them so they could meet at its ends. I do, Jon said. She kept her eyes on him and tilted her chin to show him the white scar along her collarbone. Almost pretty in the glow. Almost a necklace if death had any sense of ornament. I chose you once in a cave where the earth kept us warm like a mother, she told him, and it wanted not a blush of story to make men swallow hard and remember their own youth. I might choose you again in a hall full of eyes and knives. I might choose you in a yard full of snow. I might choose you in a ditch full of mud and fire if that's all the world left us. But I will choose, not have. The free folk around her nodded, some grimly, some grinning. A few of the northern men did too, who recognized in the words their mothers and wives and sisters. It was not a Southron sort of statement to make in a hall. It was an Old North sort of thing, older than banners. It pleased Lyanna Mormont. A hint of a smile gnawed its way onto her face. "I would not have it any other way," Jon said. Lord Glover made a noise as if spitting a sliver of bone. "The dead do not care who lies with whom," he said. "But the living do. I tell you this. I'll follow you to war, Snow, so long as you take good counsel. But if you make me bow my head to a wildling in Winterfell, I'll take my men home." "If you go home now," Davos said, mild and ragged, "home may go from you. Winter does not consider pride, my lord. It takes the stubborn and the flexible alike if they don't prepare." "This is preparing?" Glover demanded, stabbing a finger toward Ygritte. "This is what we bled for?" Lyanna Mormont stood. She didn't bother with knives in her voice. When she was angry, her words went very still. "I bled for the North because the North remembers," she said. "It remembers that when the dead came, the free folk fought them and the Boltons fed them us. I'm not so small-minded that I'd prefer a southern kind of proper to a northern kind of true. We need every man and woman with a sword or a bow." She looked at Ygritte as if measuring her in units of arrows. "If our Lord Snow wants to braid his hair to a woman who shot him once, that's his lookout. If she wants him and he wants her, I don't know what it's to anyone else whether they lie under fur together. If a Mormont can say that, perhaps a Glover can keep his mouth shut until the dead are done with us." "That's a speech fit for a king," Tormund said, winking. "Or a bear." "Do not wink at me, wildling," Lyanna said, but the corner of her mouth twitched upward anyway. Jon Royce cleared his throat. "The Vale came because Lady Sansa asked," he said. "We came because the Boltons had to be broken and this keep restored to its rightful owners. We are not minded to become entangled in northern marriage politics. But," he paused, weighing how wide the word might crack the ice, "if your affection allows the free folk to keep their word and patrol the roads north of here and keep the old lands clear of bandits and the embers of Bolton men, that is to our advantage." "We've kept our word," Tormund said, wounded in pride. "Did we break?" He advanced a step, wild as a winter hill. "Tell me who broke and I'll break them back." "No one is saying you have not kept it, Sire," Royce said, bristling at the lack of title applied to himself even as he offered the wrong honorific to Tormund. "I have seen you fight and I am glad I fought with you. The Vale has no quarrel with men who stand in the shield wall and keep it from breaking. I speak as a practical man. The world is the way it is now. Let us make use of it." The mutters went on for a while, like wind that refuses to settle even after you've barred the door. Jon listened. He let people speak, because words said in a hall can be owned. Words muttered in corridors fester. Finally, when it felt as if the tide would not change more, he lifted a hand. "We have provisions to count and 100 decisions to make," he said. "I won't make them alone. Lady Sansa will hear you on matters of stores. Ser Davos will take your numbers for the watch rotations on the east and south walls. Lord Royce, I ask your men help drill those who are too new to hold a spear without turning it against themselves when they pivot." Tormund. He met the wildling's eye. "Take your people through the town and out beyond the winter town in bands of 20. Watch for wolves that do not behave like wolves. Watch for men with no breath. Burn anything that doesn't argue convincingly for living." "That we can do," Tormund said, pleased. "And if someone shoots at her," his chin jerked toward Ygritte, "I'll take his hands and wear them as mittens." "Don't," Ygritte said. "That's nasty. Wear his ears if you have to. That's at least a choice." Sansa's breath came out steadily, a visible thread in the cold. "This council is dismissed," she said, clear. "We will reconvene at first light tomorrow to discuss the harvest from the winter town and the issue of mills. I expect representatives from House Manderley and House Serwyn present, and the masters of the mills if they can be found. Tormund, send someone to the garrison kitchens. We'll see your bands are fed before they go." Chairs scraped, men stamped, grateful for the excuse to move. Women gathered their cloaks around them and glided out like smoke. Lord Glover met Jon's gaze as he went and inclined his head in a stiff movement that wasn't quite a threat. Yohn Royce paused to bow to Sansa, then made a show of ignoring Petyr Baelish, who had appeared silently as a shadow near a pillar halfway through. Littlefinger smiled at Sansa when their eyes met and received a look that was very stiff indeed, and then, unexpectedly, a very small, very genuine smile in return that told him he had misjudged the angle of a blade. Ygritte cut through the departing bodies as unhurried as a cat. When she came close, her eyes laughed before her mouth did. "You don't do anything small," she told Jon. "You might as well have climbed on a table and beat your chest." "I considered it," he said, deadpan, and her laughter broke out then, sharp as the crack of ice when it gives under weight, bright as a spark flying up. Sansa watched them from the dais and felt something twist in her sternum that was not jealousy and not scorn and not grief, though those were its ingredients. She forced her hands to unclench. "I'll not be at your side like some lady in blue with sleeves that drag the rushes," Ygritte said. "You understand that." "I do," Jon said. "You'll be at my side like Ygritte." She snorted, satisfied and exasperated at once. "You always were slow," she said gently. "But maybe you catch up when it's cold enough." He should have left it there. He did not. "Will you come with me to the Godswood?" he asked. Ygritte's eyebrows lounged up her forehead. "That's a place for making oaths," she said. "You've had your fill of those." "Not enough," Jon said. The admission felt like a fire drawn close. "Not the right kind." Ygritte's mouth softened, then firmed. "We'll go," she said. When they had gone, Jon with his breath smoking, Ygritte walking as if the castle were a ridge with snow crust that might give if you guessed the weight wrong. Sansa descended from the dais with graceful, measured steps. Davos fell in beside her. They walked in silence a short way, past a tapestry of Stark's hunting stag in a forest woven in greens and late gold that mocked the season outside. Petyr Baelish slid out from behind a pillar and formed a third silently. "You let him do that," Petyr said, tone mild as milk. "You allowed him his theater. Very clever. He will owe you now. It's a debt he'll not think of until he needs to pay it, and then it will be too late." Sansa looked at him without heat. "I did not let him," she said. "He would have said it if I'd told him no. He's like father that way."
Ah, Petyr murmure.
"Your father's qualities did not serve him in King's Landing." "Winterfell is not King's Landing," Sansa said. She said it simply, like a fact about weather. "And you are not my father." She was tired of men telling her how to think about men they did not resemble. Baelish's hand twitched, touching the point of his chin. He produced a smile, soft, flattering. "You may need the veil more than you think," he said. "You may need friends who understand how to get things done when speeches and honor do not suffice." "We will need the veil," Sansa said, "and we will have it. And if there are to be friends, Lord Baelish, they will be such because they think of my needs and not their own. Do you understand?" For an instant, he smiled the honest smile of a man outmaneuvered and charmed by it. Then he slid away again into mildness. "As my lady says." Davos watched all this with a tradesman's eye for goods moving and measured the worth of words the way he would have measured barrels. When Baelish had gone, he said quietly, "He's a bad wind. He'll blow trouble down your chimneys." "He already has," Sansa said. "But the chimneys hold." "Thank you, Ser Davos." "For what?" He looked nonplussed. "For saying true things when you could say easy ones." He scratched the back of his neck, embarrassed. "The truth's cheaper," he said. "You don't have to remember it afterward quite so hard." Snow made the Godswood quieter even than usual. Winterfell's heart tree wore its red leaves like a crown set crooked by weather. The face cut in the white bark wept sap that had frozen into beads and then thawed and then frozen again, so that it seemed to be crying pearls crackled with frost. The hot springs knitted steam into the air here and there, so you got pockets of warm breath among the cold. Ygritte stopped under the heart tree and looked up in open contempt. "It's an old man's face on a woman's body," she said. "Your tree needs sense." "The face was carved long ago," Jon said mildly. "You lot are always sucking on bones and calling it a meal," Ygritte said, but without much venom. If you like it, I can spit and make it better. Jon laughed. The sound startled a raven from a near branch. It clattered into the sky. Black ink scratched across white paper. He reached out and took Ygritte's hand. I've done badly at choosing between vows, he said. I had to die to get out of the last ones. I don't plan to do that again. You did die. Ygritte did not make it a question. She felt the truth of it when she lay with him now sometimes, the way something in him had grown terribly quiet and steady. She did not like to think about it. She was from a people who stared death in the face and spat in its eye, but they did not court it. They did not make it a companion sitting at the fire. I did, Jon said. He met the face of the heart tree rather than hers when he said it because the truth was easier when he told it to old wood. I hung from the wall. I bled. And then I woke, and it was done. Ygritte flicked her glance at him, quick as a thrown knife. And you left, she said. You walked away from your blah. CK brothers. I suppose that's one way to end it. My watch ended, Jon said, with an edge that surprised himself. I give my life, that's the oath. I gave it. Good, Ygritte said, without any special care for his trouble. Good riddance. You never suited that cloak. You were always of both ways, and men like that are bad at belonging to any. You're better being your own. Which means... She jerked her chin toward the tree, commanded the moment as if it could be brought to heel like a dog. Say what you brought me here to say. Jon released her hand and went to his knees in the snow. It made her heart lurch against her ribs. Not because she wished him to kneel, but because she did not wish him to want to do it for the wrong reasons. She stood stubbornly watching while he bowed his head. I'll not ask you to be my lady, Jon said, his voice low enough to thaw steam from his lips. I'll not promise to put you above the north. I can't. I'll not swear to keep you safe when I cannot keep boy and plowman safe from fever and cold and wolves with blue eyes. But I will swear to take your hand when we're at council and to hear your truth when it cuts mine. I'll swear to tell you my mind before I tell it to a room full of men. I'll swear to be where you are when there's a choice to be made about where I stand. I'll swear that what I said in the hall wasn't theater. I'll swear I will not lie to you, even when the truth makes you spit. He looked up steadier than he felt. I will swear to the old gods, to your gods, to any tree with a face on it or without, that I am yours as far as I am anyone's to be. It was not a Southron speech. It did not have a flourish. It was stubborn and practical and sad. Ygritte let out a breath she hadn't known she'd been holding. Then she crouched and took his jaw in her hand and kissed him, not gently and not cruelly, but with the ferocity of someone setting a brand in a log to start a fire that needed to catch or else everyone in the hall would freeze. Get up, she said against his mouth. When he had, she took his hand and turned her head and, because she was sentimental about nothing except what she chose to be sentimental about, she spit lightly at the face of the heart tree and then smiled as if she'd done something clever. There, now it's heard us. That'll do. Ghost slid noiselessly out from under a low-hung bough, vast and white, a patch of falling winter that had decided to be muscle and fawn. He set his head under Ygritte's hand without hesitation as she reached for him. You took my rabbit, she told him conversationally. Last week. Don't pretend you didn't. Ghost breathed out and blinked, eyes red as embers. He allowed the scratch, then turned and pressed his shoulder into Jon's thigh, leaving wet behind. It was blessing or warning or simple hunger. You're not wrong, Jon murmured into the fur, about any of it. They went back into the castle with a sort of quiet in their bones, the quiet that comes after a storm when the air feels wrung out and honest. It lasted until the first knife. The knife was small, meant for a close, fast work, meant to slip between ribs. Its bearer was a thin man in Glover colors who had not been born to be an assassin. He had been born to repair boots and hold horses for his betters and maybe to press a hand to a girl's hair in the hay. He had seen his lord's face in the hall and seen that his lord would not tell him to do this. He made a lord of his own anger and served it. He came not at Jon, from behind a pillar near a corridor where the rushes had been replaced and the stink of damp was not as bad as elsewhere, but at Ygritte. He aimed at the red hair because hate likes a target it can name. He would have been quick if he'd been good. He was neither. Ghost moved first. The white wolf was a blur, a growl like the bottom of the sea. The man's wrist cracked under Ghost's teeth and he cried out in shock rather than pain. Ygritte spun, seized, and had the man's fingers in one fist and the knife in the other before he remembered closing his hand on it. She could have driven his own blade into the soft of his belly. She didn't. She slammed his hand against the pillar instead. Bone made a sound like someone stepping through thin ice. The knife clattered away. "Take him," Jon said. His voice already the voice he had used on thieves and black brothers and worse things. Men came running, heavy feet on stone. Someone had the wit to pick up the knife with a cloth so it wouldn't slip. The man blubbered that he hadn't meant. Not like that. Only... They dragged him to the great hall, because the rush of movement demanded an ending, and because it was still afternoon and pale light still found its way to the far beams. Sansa was there, listening to a miller and nodding at the right times and writing names in a neat hand on a slate that a boy held. She looked up, took in blood, took in the knife in a cloth, took in Ygritte with her hair loose from its figuring and Ghost with frost clumped at his chin, and went still with a terrible, precise stillness. "Who is he?" she asked. "Lou Harl," said a Glover man, pale. "He holds a strip of land near the lower wood. He lost 2 sons to the Boltons, my lady. And so he decided to gift the Boltons another?" Lyanna Mormont's voice knifed from the lower benches where she had been conferring with a cook about salt pork. "Hold him." She dropped back into her chair and watched as if watching a play she had paid a dear price to see. The hall filled as if dragged by a tide. Littlefinger appeared as he always did when blood was in the air and managed to look as if it pained him to watch a man come to harm. Jon Royce stood like a statue hammered from some dark metal. Tormund prowled like a caged beast barely recalled to domestication. Jon came up the steps to the dais and stood before the high seat. He did not sit. He looked down at Lou Harl, who looked like scrub brush in a hard winter. Brittle, gray, liable to snap in his own wind. "Did you break bread within these walls?" Jon asked. The man nodded, sick. "Aye." "Did you share the salt?" "Aye." "And then you took a knife against a guest." Silence held. The word guestright was not spoken, but it hung in the air like a drift of breath. Younger men had broken it in the South and thought it politics. The North remembered that it was older than law. "Aye," Harl said. She's not a guest. She's a wildling. She's under this roof," Sansa said. "She is at my table when she eats. You tried to kill a woman who fought alongside us." It was not the worst she had seen men do. It was not in the top 10. But it felt like a particular kind of thing, like the moment a crack appears in ice and you hear it splintering and must decide whether to run for shore or stand very still and hope. "Whatever she is," Harl said, sobs not far under his words. "She's a sign of what's wrong. We have ways." We do," Jon said. He stepped forward until the man had to tilt his head to look up into his face. "Our way is this. When a man who has eaten at my table takes a knife against one who's under my roof, he is made to answer for it." He turned slowly so that all could see his face. "I will pass the sentence," he said. He heard his father's voice in his own and felt his throat close. He swallowed it open. "And I will swing the sword." Tormund started to speak, stopped himself. Davos closed his eyes. Sansa said nothing at all, which was consent. Littlefinger's eyes angled to see whether the lords looked pleased or afraid. His mouth made a shape that could pay either cost if it turned out to be required. They took the man's broken wrist and bound it so it would not flop in indecency as he walked. They walked him through snow that squeaked with cold. A dozen followed because the North will not allow justice to be done in private. In the yard, men looked up from their work and women paused with baskets on their hips and boys stopped the game they had made of throwing frozen dung at a post. The executioner's block had been replanned and salted. Longclaw was Valyrian steel, a thin singing in the mind if one let oneself hear it. Jon did not. He knelt on one knee, laid the blade upon the snow, pressed both hands to the hilt, and bent his head a heartbeat. "This is no joy," he said, "because the gods care about words." Then he stood and did as the North required. It was quickly done. It had to be. That was part of the justice too. Blood steamed. Ghost stood near enough to smell it and watch, and not so close as to crowd. Ygritte's face was set in the particular expression she wore when men did something that made sense and hurt anyway. She did not turn away. The man's head rolled, not far. A boy near the kitchen lost whatever he had eaten last, and someone rubbed his back with a hand that knew how to comfort a young one. The North took the weight of it, settled it in its bones. When it was over, they salted the block again and covered it against the snow. Jon wiped the blade with a cloth that had been put in his hand and could not say who had put it there. He looked up and saw Sansa, cheeks white but head high. He saw Lyanna Mormont, small and fierce and watching like a hawk. He saw Ygritte, who came to him slowly and put her hand on his wrist and kept it there until his breath steadied again. "You did what your father taught you," she said, and it was not praise. It was naming what had happened, the way she would name the species of a track or the direction of the wind. "It will cost us Glover," Jon said. "It might buy you some Mormont you didn't have already," she said, jerking her chin toward the girl with the bare pin, who was watching with a look of savage approval that turned out to be for the fact that Jon had done it himself rather than for the death itself. "And it might keep men's mouths closed in halls. Better that than knives in corners." She was right. He knew it. He hated that she had to be. That night, Winterfell clenched down hard. The wind came from the north and tore ribbons from the torches in the yard. It made the walls sing. The smithy pounded a steady note low as a headache. Sansa went from fire to fire on the first floor to see who had blankets and who had not, and to curse the mice who stole the starch from the oats. She found herself with her hands deep in a barrel of rye, counting with a miller's wife and speaking the chicken scratch arithmetic of survival. Her hair smelled like smoke. She slept like a stone and woke 3 times with knives in her chest that turned out to be dreams. First of Ramsay Bolton's dogs, then of Joffrey's mouth making a little shape just before it filled with purple, then of the heart tree crying red that froze to white. Jon did not sleep at all. He walked the walls with Ghost at his side. He felt the ache of the day in his forearms. In the Watchers' huts, he drank broth that tasted of bone and salt and gratitude. He looked north across the flat white that used to be the winter town and saw it mottled now with cook fires and the hard black lines of fur tents the free folk had put up because stone made them uneasy and because they liked knowing they could break a camp in a minute and be gone, even here. Beyond, the snow carried voices. He looked up by mood or instinct, not hearing but feeling something in the wind. A raven came like a story told in ink. It landed on the crenellation near his hand and cocked its head and fixed him with one furious red eye. Its leg carried a twist of leather. He took the scrap from it, worked the thong loose. The bird didn't peck him. It behaved like a thing too tired to bother with old habits. When he unrolled the paper, the words were in a strong, spiky hand. Crows sighted. Packs at the edge of the long lake. Not wolves. Not men. Not right. Moving fast. We burned one. It screamed long after the fire took it. Send men to the last hearth. The dead move like weather. The signature was a mark he knew. A clumsy tree, the way a hand that could not write had learned to imitate a tree. Othel Yarwick had used that sign at the end of petitions when Jon had been Lord Commander. Then he died. Men had come on after, and their names had fallen out of the world. The mark now was someone else's. A boy with red hands holding cold metal with a vow like ice in his blood. The wall still stood. The watch still wrote. He had known. He had said the words. And yet seeing them written made his stomach pitch, as if part of him had expected the world to forgive Winterfell a while because of what it had built back that was good. The world did not forgive. Winter came on like a blind god. He found Sansa, woke her with a hand on her shoulder because one thing he could do for her was never again let her wake with hate. She came up fast from sleep into clear-headed wakefulness. She took the paper, read, handed it back, and began to speak before he asked. "You will need the mountain clans," she said. "The Wolves, the Norries, the Littles. You will want their men who can move through snow like foxes. Lyanna will send Mormont men because she's too proud not to. The Glovers will not today. Davos can hold the walls. Brienne." She paused, and a softer expression touched her face. She had begun to trust Brienne the way a woman trusts another woman who has kept a promise when it cost her. "Brienne will ride with you unless you ask her to stay. I think you should ask her to stay. She's better as a rock than as a spear in a moving fight." "Tormund and his people will go," Jon said. "Ygritte will want to." "Then let her," Sansa said, surprising herself with how easy it was to say it. "If she's with you, there will be fewer knives for her in corners here." He closed his hands and opened them. "I would have you stay behind the walls." "Thank you," Sansa said, and he knew she had heard the other thing. "I trust you to do what I cannot." She wrapped a cloak, belted it, took a deep breath. "We will be here when you come back. If you do not, we will be here still." He did not kiss her brow. That had been father's gesture. He said only, "Hold them," and left her to find Lyanna and Davos and Brienne, and to work on rosters with the miller's wife who wrote numbers more neatly than any maester they had seen. When he found Ygritte, she was at the archery butts behind the old kennels with 3 Manderly boys who had mocked her, and then, after she had pinned her arrows 3 in a row so tight you could have laid a hand across their fletchings and not touched skin, suddenly found themselves listening as if the wind were teaching. She lowered her bow when she saw his face, her mouth pulled tight in the corner. "We go," she said, not asking. "We go," Jon said, "to the last hearth." She strung her bow with a neat jerk that could mean anger or pleasure. With Ygritte it meant both. "There's a warm stream through a hollow near there. If it's not froze hard, it's a good place to trap. We'll feed our bellies, and then we'll feed flames with anything that doesn't belong to them. Bring oil. Bring rope. Bring the old woman from the town who knows how to listen with the heel of her boot. She can tell you whether the ice will hold." He almost smiled. There was relief in being told what to do by someone who was not worried about how it would look in a hall. "You'll be at my side," he said. She fitted an arrow to the string and drew and held it as if she purposes to shoot a star. "I will be where I will be," she said, "but I'll be near enough to laugh if you fall down." They rode out with a lean company at dawn, the sky a pale knife in the east and purple bruises of cloud rolling over like slow waves. Free folk went fast and light with packs and little sleds. They dragged themselves rather than trust to horses. Mountain men of the Wool and Norei moved like ghosts in snow. Lyanna had sent 20 Mormont men, hard-eyed and short and good at killing with silent faces. Jon rode with Ghost loping at his stirrup and Tormund carrying a spear with a black head that looked like melted night. The road to the last hearth was a pale wound in the land. Wind skated across it and smoothed their passing almost as quickly as they made it. The sound of the company was breath and leather and the small, bell-hard noises of iron bits. They found the first sign at the edge of the long lake, where willows thrust up fistfuls of frozen hair. A deer lay with its head twisted wrong. Men don't often break a deer's neck. It's too hard. The prints around it were not prints so much as a confusion. A dance of whiteness stirred until it could not settle. There was fire blackened on the snow. Jon crouched and laid his fingers in the char, feeling negative heat burned into his skin. "Not long," Ygritte said behind him. She knelt and put her cheek to the snow as if listening. "Less than a night." They found the first of them at the old shepherd's hut in the hollow by the stream Ygritte had promised. It came at them as if it had been sleeping with its eyes open. They do. It was a man in the remnants of black, a boy by the looseness of the jaw, his mouth open on an oath that had died with him. His fingers were broken at the tips as if he had clawed his way out of a drift. His eyes were blue like lake ice that never thaws. He came for Ygritte with terrible intention. She let herself go loose and dropped under his grasp and came up with the obsidian knife Tormund had thrown her 3 winters ago as a joke. She drove it up under his jaw. The blue went out as if someone had set a hand over a candle. The boy collapsed as lightly as if he'd been hollow all along. One of the Mormont men made a small sound, long and low. Grief escaped its cage a moment without shaming the man. "Burn him," Jon said. They went up the hollow with fire. They found a woman with no eyes. They found a man with teeth marks on his forearm as if a child had gnawed him and smiled. They found the shepherd's collie, her paws bloody with digging. Jon took the dog's head in his lap and watched her breathe and then not breathe. He felt the world trying to turn everything left into a kind of memory you could not use, only keep. At dusk, they saw them. They came across the lake, not stepping and not sliding, but simply there and then there, as if distance had forgotten how to be counted for things dead. They came in a line as long as the edge of a dream, and their eyes were blue in a way that felt like blasphemy against a color men had loved. Ghost's hackles stood. He did not bark, did not waste his breath on warning something that did not care. Jon's men fell into line without yelling, which is how you know some of them had already seen this and did not need to be told how to fear. Ygritte strung her bow and put the first arrow into the eye of a boy who had not been older than Lyanna. She did not watch him fall. She took the second and then the third. When she missed once because the wind came hard across the lake with a hiss, she spat at it and adjusted her aim and did not miss again. They lit the firebreak at the edge of the ice, oil poured and coarse cloth laid across the snow so it would catch. Caught and then leapt, 100 tongues eating cold. When the first line of whites reached it, they stumbled and were fire, and then they were dead again in a way that the world could understand and accept. But they kept coming. They always kept coming. Jon found himself eye to eye with a man who had once been a maester. His chain fused to the flesh of his neck by ice, and killed him with long claw, the blade singing that pitch heard in the mind that said yes, yes, yes to endings. They fell back in good order. It is an ugly phrase for a holy thing. Tormund laughed on. See, a sound that had nothing to do with humor. Ygritte put an arrow into a shape that had been a wolf and then another into the thing's mouth when the first failed to convince it should be done. She went down on one knee to string another, and the ice under her knee cracked, and she sprang up and swore and smiled into Jon's face when she found him there and kissed him quick like stealing something from a full table and not being caught. "You'll do," she said, which meant, "I love you still, you fool." By the time full dark had fallen, the dead were milling at the edge of the lake. The heat of the firebreak melting the ice into slush they did not mind and could not cross fast without slipping. The living hitched their belts tighter and counted their men and found that they had fewer than when they had come. In the distance, far, a horn sounded. Not one of theirs. A horn that had not been blown by living lungs for a very long time. Or so it sounded. The bones in Jon's forearm remembered it. The hair along his neck remembered it. "Go," Jon said. "Now." He did not raise his voice. They would not run faster because he yelled. They moved. They made a long, ragged line that scissored through the snow between the little ridges of rock that marked the path to the last hearth. Ygritte went backward for a time, shooting into the dark, then turned and ran, her breath making a stitch under her ribs. Jon ran at her side. Ghost kept pace. The Mormont men carried one of their number on a crude sled, taking turns with the rope without speaking, their mouths a narrow line of ache. Tormund muttered to himself inventory or prayer, and if he spoke Mance Rayder's name, there was no blasphemy in it. The dead followed at a pace that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with cold. They made the last hearth by the pale black hour after midnight when everything feels like a lie. The palisade was stout enough to stop a band of raiders from the marsh in a summer with grass. It was nothing to the winter to come. They got men up, the men who had stayed, a handful old enough to know better and young enough not to care. They built another firebreak, and this one caught and stayed caught because the Manderley boys who had mocked Ygritte had learned something from an hour in the yard and tied their cloth differently, and because the wind turned in their favor like a debt owed to no one in particular. By morning there were bodies in the ditch that could be burned. By noon the dead had moved on in a slow wheel, patient as winter. They would come again. They always did. The living gathered their pieces. The woman whose eyes were gone had a husband who sat down with her hands in his and refused to let go until his fingers froze, and they had to prise them apart and wrap them in wool to keep them from breaking. Jon did not say, "We cannot afford this because some things you must afford or there's no reason to spend gold on anything else." When they rode back to Winterfell, they were dirtier and fewer, and something in them had gone very, very still that would not start again until spring, and perhaps not even then. The wind sang the old song the North writes for itself and refuses to teach to outsiders. You are alive and it costs and you pay and you do it again until you cannot. They came through the gates with their lines long and ragged, and Sansa stood in the yard with her cloak drawn tight and counted them with the expert's eye she had learned, counting grown men in gold and children who could carry arrows. She found Jon in the line and allowed herself a breath that left her like surrender, and then turned and started issuing orders. Because relief can be comfort, but it can also be a weakness. She would have neither. Ygritte swung down from her horse and rolled her shoulders and laughed when Ghost shoved his head into her side with a sound that was almost a purr, and would have been if a beast that size could purr without shaking a wall down. She went to Sansa then, uninvited, because she had decided that if she were to live under this stone, she would not creep like a dog. Sansa straightened a fraction, and the difference between them hung in the air like a scarf in a stiff wind. One woman made in halls and one made in wind. You kept them, Ygritte said. I did, Sansa said. You brought them back. I brought back the ones I could. Ygritte's tone made no apology for what winter had taken. The dead came like weather. I know, Sansa said. She made herself say it. Thank you. They stood together for a moment longer, breathing in steam in the cold. Women different as different could be, who might yet find a way to stand near without hurting each other. Then Sansa moved, because she always had something to do, and because she could not bear to be idle while men breathed hard in the yard, and a woman from the winter town cried soundlessly into her scarf. Ygritte watched her go with a complicated expression, and then went to find Tormund and make sure he hadn't eaten something that would kill him, because Tormund's stubbornness could be relied on to wrestle bears but not to discriminate between mushrooms. That night, the hall was quieter than usual. The men who had come back did not want songs. They wanted bread and heat and quiet. The lords had the sense to hold their tongues. There were fewer torches. The smoke went up straight into the rafters, as if it were drawing a map of something beyond the ceiling. Jon felt himself filling up with a kind of courage that sometimes feels like tiredness, and he almost did not stand. Then he did, because the winter will not accept might from men who won't lift their heads. The last hearth holds, he said. The dead came and we sent them away. They'll come again. They may come other places first. We'll send men to Cerwyn and to Hornwood. We'll get the mountain clans down, and we'll give them the bacon they'll demand, and we'll bear their contempt, which they may yet have earned of us. We'll feed the free folk in camps where the walls can see them, and we'll feed the winter town inside these walls where the free folk can see them. If I hear of a knife, I'll make whoever held it answer for it. If the dead come to our gates, we'll burn them, and we'll learn how to say a prayer while we hold a torch. He paused. He looked out across the hall from bench to bench. He saw Ygritte by the post where she could see the door and be gone in a breath if she had to. He saw Sansa just behind him with Davos, her head inclined, listening. He saw Lyanna with her chin slanted like a dare. He saw Littlefinger pale as paper, weighing the weight of events and finding it heavy. Jon took a breath. I said something the other day, he said, and now a ripple went through the room because he never did this. He did not make apology a currency. I said I loved a woman and would have her at my side. There were men who said it was not their concern, and men who said it was, and one man who thought it was worth a knife. He nodded toward the block without looking at it. I say again that I will have her at my side and be at hers. I say I will hear her when she says I am wrong, and I will not pretend I do not hear. I say that her truth and mine together will hold this place better than mine alone. And I say that any man who sees a woman with a bow and calls her a whore is a fool who will die because he misnames the only thing keeping the winter out of his bed. Silence, then a murmur, then the slow scrape of a bench as Lord Manderley stood. His belly preceded him. His voice was a rumble like distant thunder across salt water. When my grandsire's father ate fat in a famine, he said, men called him a glutton until they tasted the meat. Then they called him wise for keeping stores. I am not the man my ancestors were. I am not thin, but I know this. When the winter comes, you take what keeps you alive and you call it good and you thank it. The free folks' arrows kept my nephew breathing yesterday. So did a Mormont's spear. So did a Stark sword. I'll call that all good, and I'll thank it. And if the Lord Snow wants to share his blanket with the woman who put a shaft through a thing that wanted to climb into my nephew's belly, I'll bake them both a pie if the ovens hold. In another corner, Lord Glover made a disgusted noise and then, slowly, grudgingly, shook his head as if arguing with himself and finding that he was a fool and hated discovering it in public. He stood too. He looked older today. "I was wrong about whether this belongs in this hall," he said. "It does, because everything that keeps my men alive belongs here. I won't kneel to a wildling, Snow, but I'll drink with one who stood a line at the lake. I'll not take my men home. Home is any place that isn't winter, and there's only one of those left. We'll stay." Lyanna lifted her chin. "Bear Island stands with Winterfell," she said. "We said it before the battle. We say it still." Others spoke then, not in speeches but in those small admissions that change the weather in a room. Nods, a hand clapped to a table twice, the kind of quiet that means consent. Jon Royce inclined his head and said, "The Vale will hold one more season," which was all you were going to get out of a man who wore his courtesy like a cuirass. Baelish was very quiet indeed. Afterward, when the hall had emptied a little and the steam of men was not so thick, Sansa found Jon again at the foot of the dais, and for once no one was calling to him. She stood a hair closer than two people speak unless they are family or lovers. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much and somehow were better for it. "You were right," she said without introduction. "To say it in the hall. It made it true. It took a shape men could understand. I don't like that this is the language we have to use, but we have it, so we'll speak it." "Thank you," Jon said. "If I did wrong. If you had done it only for love, it might have been wrong," she said. She smiled a little because some of the snow in her chest was thawing. Just there, just briefly. "But you did it for the North, and for yourself. I cannot begrudge you that. I begrudged you happiness, maybe, once, because it is expensive and others always make the payments. But the men who died today would not have chosen differently if you had been colder in the hall. So why should you freeze when they do not ask it?" Jon looked like a man presented with a blanket and not quite trusting that it did not have thorns in it. "I'll try," he said. "Do," Sansa said. She looked over his shoulder. Ygritte stood in their hall as if the weight of the beams weighed nothing to her. She had her hand on Ghost's head. The wolf tolerated it. That kindness made Sansa feel fonder than anything else had. "You could have done worse," she said, and then, so he would know she meant it sincerely, "You could have done better too, but men rarely do. She will knock you with her elbow when you forget to look for knives. I like that in a woman who'll stand by my brother." He laughed, sudden and clean. "Thank you," he said again. They married 2 days later with as little ceremony as could still be called ceremony. It was not a Southron wedding. There were no Septus prayers. The Godswood was white and red and cold, and the heart tree watched them like an old woman who approves of youth and forgets none of it. They stood with their feet where the ground steamed warm in patches, a trick of Winterfell's under rivers. Sansa and Lyanna stood as witnesses, and Davos, and Tormund with arms crossed like a bridge and his face in grave lines that surprised anyone who did not know him. Ghost lay like a fall of snow and watched the leaves. Jon took Ygritte's hands and she took his, and they spoke words that meant more than they sounded like. Words about standing and not standing, about coming back when you could, about not leaving when staying would kill you. They tied a beat-up strip of leather around their wrists to show that they had decided to be caught in one knot. And when the knot held, it meant the old gods had not bothered to cut it. Tormund sniffed loudly when it was done and said, "I suppose you'll be wanting a feast." Ygritte elbowed him in the ribs the way Sansa had predicted, and he laughed like a man cut from big cloth. "Aye," he said to Jon, softer. "You did well." They ate what could be spared. It was mostly hare and onion, which is what winter calls bread when it needs to. Manderly had sent up 3 little pies anyway, because a man cannot break every habit and call himself the same man. Ygritte ate with both hands and told Lyanna that she was too pretty to look so mean, and Lyanna told her to mind her mouth or she'd put a spear through it. And they grinned at each other with a ferocity that made Davos rub the bridge of his nose to hide his pleasure. Sansa spoke with Brienne softly about a thing that had to do with one of the younger women in the winter town who was too near childbirth to be left without a dry place. Littlefinger came and offered winter wine and smiled, and Sansa took it and thanked him and told him in a tone like snow on stone that he no longer needed to trouble himself with Ramsay Bolton in her dreams because she had found better things to keep her awake. Jon and Ygritte, after as much feasting as they could bear, which was not a great deal, went to a small chamber near the inner ward where the stones kept the day's heat and where steam ghosted up the walls like friendly presences. It had a bed. It had a heavy curtain. It had a narrow window where snow had tufted and shimmered like fleece. They stood very still, the two of them, and then kissed like starving people eat. She pushed him onto the bed and then pushed him again when he made some Southron idea out of it. "Don't be pretty," she said. "Be you." He was. The winter outside kept out by stone that had felt 1,000 such nights and would feel 1,000 more. Later, when their breaths had calmed and his mind was his again, he put his hand on her head where her hair lay like a pelt across his chest and said, "I meant to keep you safe." She dug her chin into his ribs and said, "I meant to keep you honest." And that was marriage enough for the old gods or any gods sensible in winter. The news ran ahead of them, of the fire at the lake and the boys in black, and of Lou Harl's head falling in clean snow, and of Lord Manderley's speech, and of Lord Glover's grudging change. Far to the east, men in black at Eastwatch by the sea put their backs to the wind, and the sea ice groaned like old ships, and something moved under it that was not a whale. Far to the south, in Old Town, a boy with a sword that had once belonged to a man who knew too much and too little at once to be tolerated wrote a letter by candlelight about Dragonglass and a place called Dragonstone, and did not know to whom he addressed it except to Jon Snow, because he had drawn that name like a charm around himself when he had had nothing else. 1,000 small things set themselves moving, and some of them would be the death of other things, and some of them would be the life. In Winterfell, the work went on with a steadiness that looked like courage and was. The free folk and the North learned each other's ways in the way men learn languages they do not love. One insult at a time, one joke told twice, one gesture at the point of a spear that is meant as a threat and interpreted as a greeting and becomes, through repetition, both. Women from the winter town watched Ygritte's hands as she fletched and took the lesson to their daughters. Men from the mountains watched Davos's patience with a green boy and learned not to mock it. Tormund learned the word for Q and swore he would never use it, but used it in the kitchens anyway because it got him soup faster. Lyanna Mormont invented 2 new ways to insult a man's courage and taught them to Brienne, who never used them but smiled when she said them out loud in practice. Sansa found 3 ways to keep flour dry and a 4th way she was saving for a worse day. Winter does not stand still when men are busy. It comes to your door and knocks. If you do not answer, it comes in. It knocked one morning with a sound like a pole against a gate, and a man on the other side calling with a cracked voice and snow in his beard that made him look 100 years old though he was 30. He had ridden from Cerwyn with 6 men and 2 boys with frostbite on both their feet. He had a bundle under his cloak that he held against his belly like the last ember of his house. When he came into the hall, he cried because the air did not bite his lungs. He knelt to no one because he was too tired to kneel, and because the North remembers when kneeling becomes a lie. "They come," he said to Jon, who met him halfway down the middle aisle with his hand outstretched. "The dead, through the pines, through the marsh. We burned. They screamed. They didn't stop screaming." His eyes were raw. "My lord, my..." He did not know what to call Jon. He settled for, "Jon Snow. We came." "You did," Jon said, and took the bundle gently from the man's arms. It was a child the size of a sack of flour, not sleeping, not making a sound, because sometimes children learn so early to save their breath that it changes what kind of people they will be later. Jon put his palm over the child's head and felt heat and thought, "Maybe." He handed the little thing to Sansa, who took it as if it were the prince of something and walked away with it in her hand steady and sure, shouting orders to clear a warm space and find a clean cloth and get the woman from the winter town who had brought 3 births into the world by cursing at them until they decided to arrive just to shut her up. Jon turned to the Cerwyn man again. "You'll eat," he said. "Then you'll sleep. Then you'll tell me exactly where." "There's a stand of birch," the man said, weeping into his beard, "white as bones. Before you get to it, you turn where the ground holds a shine, like iron under the snow. There's a hollow where my father used to set snares for pheasant. There won't be pheasant. There's something else. He ate, he slept, he told them, they went." Jon and Ygritte did not always ride side by side. They had learned not to need that for proof. But when the wind was wrong or when the lake reflected the sky in a way that made the world feel like an upside-down bowl, they drifted to each other, touched a glove to a knee or reached for the same cup of melted snow and felt that lift in the chest that tells you that even in winter there are fires that are not to be regretted. There came a day when Sansa stood in the great hall and said words she had not prepared and did not rehearse, because sometimes you find speech like an arrow on the ground and cannot not pick it up. "My lords," she said, "I listened to Lord Jon speak of love here, and I thought, what a madness for a room built for war." She felt her heart beating, hard and honest. "But I have seen what love makes of men. It makes them hold when they would run. It makes them pick up children not their own and carry them until their fingers bleed. It makes them teach a boy how to tie a knot that won't come loose, because someday that boy may tie it on your sleeve. If love is a thing we can use to hold this hall through winter, then I will have it here, and if any man thinks it weak, he can say so to my face, and I will hand him a sword and take him outside and show him how weak it is." She sat down after and found her hands killed with shaking beneath the table. She pressed them to the wood and waited until the tremor stilled, and then got up and went back to flour and numbers and blankets and law. One evening, when the sky had cleared and stars had been flung out like a car, Alas God's silver, Jon went up on the parapet and went very still, because that is how you hear what the world is saying when it is not saying it to anyone. Ygritte found him there and did not speak at first. They stood with their shoulders almost touching and looked north. The wind came down and smelled of old frost. "There's a story," she said after a time had stretched itself thin and playable between them like gut on a harp. "We tell it when it's too cold to sleep and too dangerous to talk, because a story makes it feel like someone's with you besides the wind. There's a girl who falls in love with a man who wears a shirt of ice. She likes the way he makes the world look clean. She follows him because he leaves no tracks, and she wants to learn how to do that. She learns to be thin and quiet and hard. She learns to sleep with the wind and wake with the dark. One day she finds him in a cave where there's fire, because even men in shirts of ice like their toes whole. She takes off his shirt because she wants to see what his chest looks like under it. His chest is just a chest. So she laughs. He laughs. They warm each other, and then he puts his shirt back on because that's who he is. She puts hers on because that's who she is. They walk out of the cave together because that's what people do. They belong to no one. That's the story. It's a foolish story. It makes us warm for a bit." "Why do you tell me?" Jon asked. "So you won't ask me to take off my shirt and keep it off," Ygritte said. She turned to look at him then, and her eyes held all the savage humor he loved and all the mercy she pretended never to carry. "And so you'll tell me to put it back on when I need to, and I'll tell you when you need to put yours back on, too. And maybe we won't die before we have to." "Maybe," Jon said, and the word was a warm thing between them that made the wind for a moment a little less sharp. They did not die before they had to. The winter had more work to do first. It sent ravens. It sent fog that moved like a living thing. It sent men from the south with gold and fear on their faces. And it sent news from across the sea that in Dragonstone there was stone black as water that killed the others, and that a woman with dragons had landed on sand that had not felt their shadows in a long time. It sent a boy to the gates of Winterfell with skin as pale as wax and eyes like steel, and a gift for knowing things he had not seen with his body. Bran Stark was his name, though he did not behave like a boy named. He behaved like a wind that remembered being a boy. Jon looked at him and felt something heavy rearrange itself inside his chest, as if someone had shifted the foundations of a building. Sansa looked at him and then at Jon and then at the world, and took one step forward and laid her hands on her brother's cheeks and kissed his strange brow and did not let herself weep. Ygritte looked at him and said, "You're like the ones who've been dead for a long time but aren't." And Bran said, "I'm not dead," with no heat at all, and she laughed and called him Crow, and he smiled a crack in his winter. There would be more. There would be Dany and ships and dragonglass mined from under a castle that was an old story. There would be men who had been your friends and then not. There would be babies born and small graves dug with pickaxes heated in fires between swings to keep the iron from shattering in the cold. There would be a boy named Ned who would laugh like his name were a road he could run upon. There would be betrayals too, because people are not food and cannot be preserved with salt. They spoil with fear and hunger. There would be decisions, and none of them clean. There would be a thing at the head of the army of the dead with a face as unreadable as the heart tree and a sword that turned men's blades brittle. and there would be men like Jon who stepped forward anyway because the step forward was the only way to stand. But for a while, just long enough to be a story men could tell when it was too cold to sleep, the great hall of Winterfell held warmth and held truth spoken aloud, and a wildling woman with hair like autumn lay down her bow by a hearth she had once wanted to piss on and laughed with a northern girl who wore a bear on her breast, and a bastard with a sword that had belonged to dead kings said aloud that love could be spoken of in a hall built for war and not bring the roof down. Snow fell like sifted ash through the smoke hole and melted on the rushes, and men stamped it into the reed mat until it was gone. The torches hissed when a flake found them. Ghost slept with his red eyes open. And when night crept close enough to press its face to the windows and fog the cold glass, Jon and Ygritte went to the Godswood and stood under the white tree that did not approve and said nothing and felt the breath of the hot spring on their fingers. They didn't speak vows. They had said enough. They stood where men had stood for 1,000 years and looked at a world that did not care who they were and yet would be different for having been walked upon by them. Ygritte took his hand. Jon took hers. The winter took a breath and did not let it out yet. "You know nothing, Jon Snow," she said then, not as a jeer but as an apology and a promise and an endearment. "I know you," he said, and the old tree watched them not unkindly as the snow came down and the wind sung a note that was neither holy sorrow nor holy joy but something rich enough to bear them both.